Hi, I'm Elaine Shuttle, a children's librarian at the Milton Public Library, and I'm here today for more Tales from the Story Hat. On my hat today, there's a little bug that reminds me of the story of the beetle bush. Arabelle Mott had a case of the grumps. She couldn't do anything right. If she drew a picture of a flower, people would look at it and say, "What's that supposed to be?" If she tried turning a cartwheel, people would say, "What was that supposed to be?" She handed her mother a slip of paper. Her mother looked at it and said, "What's this supposed to be?" "Oh," said Arabelle, "it's a poem. It tells how I feel." Her mother read, "My life is pale and stale. My life is a failure." "Arabelle, you're too young to be a failure," said her mother. "But it's how I feel," said Arabelle. "Why don't we bake a cake?" "All right," said Arabelle, "I'll try anything." So they got out the flour and the sugar and the butter and the milk and the eggs, and they sifted flour and they stirred in eggs and milk and butter and sugar, and then they poured the mix into a cake pan, and Arabelle's mother put it in the oven to bake. They started cleaning up the kitchen, and the doorbell rang. Arabelle's mother went to answer the door, and as she left the kitchen, she said to Arabelle, "Be sure to watch the cake, Arabelle." Her mother went off to the door, and Arabelle went over to the stove and opened the oven door. When she first opened it and looked in, the cake was high and round and brown, and as she watched, it slowly sank down to the bottom of the pan and became a wrinkled mess. Her mother came back to the kitchen and said, "Arabelle, what are you doing?" "I'm watching the cake like you told me to," said Arabelle. "Oh, Arabelle," said her mother, "not like that. You can't open the oven when a cake is in there." "I can," said Arabelle, "because I am a failure." Just then her father came into the kitchen and saw the pan. "What's that supposed to be?" he said. "Ah!" cried Arabelle and ran for her room. When she got there, she took a piece of cardboard and on it she wrote, "Arabelle Mott's failure," and stuck it on the outside of her door. "What's wrong with Arabelle?" said her father. "Why did she run away when I asked her a simple question?" "Arabelle feels she's a failure," said her mother. "Oh, she's too young for that," said her father. So he went to Arabelle's room and knocked on the door. "Come in," said Arabelle. "Arabelle," said her father, "what's the matter?" "I'm a failure," said Arabelle. "Every time I try to do something, it fails." "Well, what do you like to do?" said her father. "I like to do things right," said Arabelle. "What kind of things?" said her father. "Well, I like cake, but I can't make one. And I like flowers, but I can't draw one." "Why don't you try growing them instead?" said her father. "All right," said Arabelle. "I'll try anything." She and her father went out to the yard behind their house. The yard was just mostly a patch of dirt. Her father gave Arabelle a little spade and a hoe, and she began to dig in the earth and turn it over and then chop it up fine with the hoe. She got a hose and she put a little water on it, and then she started planting some seeds. She planted pansy seeds and marigold seeds and zinnia seeds and carrot seeds and tomato seeds, even a few old bush bean seeds. And she even went so far as to plant some of the seeds from the watermelon that she'd had for lunch. She put the seeds in the ground, covered them with the dirt, and gave them a nice drink of water. And then she went in the house for the night. Every day, Arabelle was out in her garden. She would sprinkle water on all of the places where she'd planted seeds and watch for something to grow. She told all her friends about it and promised that they could have flowers and tomatoes and carrots and melons. And some of the kids came by to visit Arabelle's garden. One of her friends, Herman, came by one day, and he looked and he saw something poking up out of the ground. What's that supposed to be?" said Herman. Arabelle got down and looked at it, and she said, "I think it's a weed." But it looked so happy she didn't have the heart to pull it up, so she left it there. "I suppose weeds are okay," said Herman, "but I'd rather have watermelon." And off he went. The next day, Arabelle saw 2 little green shoots. "What are they supposed to be?" she asked her mother. "Well, the bigger one is a tomato plant," said her mother, "and the other one is the bush bean plant." "Oh," said Arabelle, "how wonderful." And now she worked in her garden even harder than before, watering it, hoeing around to keep the dirt loose. She even sang to her plants and told them funny stories to encourage them. Day by day, they began to grow. And soon, one of her other friends, named Linda, came by to see. Linda looked at the tomato vine and said, "What's that supposed to be?" Arabelle looked. "Oh, that's a snail." "What's he doing?" asked Linda. "I think he's eating my vine," said Arabelle. "But he has a nice face, and he's just trying to eat right," said Arabelle. "Ooh," said Linda, "he's icky. I'm leaving before he crawls on me." And off she went. Well, the next day, there were more snails on the vine. And the day after that, still more snails. The weeds were growing well, too. And then, on the day that Bosworth came over to visit her garden, she noticed 3 little carrot plants. Bosworth pointed to one of them. It was wiggling. "What's that supposed to be?" he said. It's a carrot plant," said Arabelle, and she went over to look down at it, and just then it disappeared, and a little furry brown snout poked out of the hole. "Oh," said Arabelle, "I think it's a mole." "Ooh, what are you going to do with that?" he said. "Nothing. It has a friendly snout," said Arabelle, "and I suppose he just wants to eat healthy." "Well," said Bosworth, "I don't want anything to do with any old mole." And off he went. Pretty soon, the other 2 carrots disappeared as well. Arabelle sighed. And then her mother came out one day to notice something on the bush bean bush. "What's that?" Arabelle's mother said as she looked at the bush bean bush. Arabelle looked closely. "I think it's a beetle," she said. "He's eating the bush bean bush." "Oh, Arabelle," said her mother, "that's too bad." Well, As the days went on, more and more snails covered the tomato vine, and more beetles covered the bush bean bush. And none of Arabelle's friends came by to visit anymore because nobody wanted to look at the bush bean bush anyway. Poor Arabelle, said her parents. Her garden is a mess. I hope the landlord never comes by to see what a mess she's made in there. It's just too bad. But as it happened, the very next day, the landlord did come by. He noticed the dirt on Arabelle's jeans and asked her, Hey, what have you been doing, Arabelle? I've been working in my garden, she said. Oh, you've made a garden in the yard? He said. Can I see it? Right away, Arabelle thought maybe she shouldn't have mentioned her garden. She sighed and said, Yeah, come on. They went out in the yard. Oh, what a mess, said the landlord. And suddenly, Arabelle couldn't stand it anymore. I will not be a failure again, she said to herself. And as the landlord pointed at the tomato vine and said, What is that? She said, That is my tomato vine. I must have, 100 happy snails living there. And this, he said, pointing to the hole where the carrots had been. Oh, that's my mole hole, said Arabelle. You have a mole? He said. At least one, said Arabelle. Oh, what about this? Oh, that's my beetle bush, said Arabelle. I must have 150 happy, healthy beetles living on that bush alone. Oh, goodness, said the landlord. And then he noticed a little jar with some black specks in it. What's that? He said. Oh, those are my weed seeds, said Arabelle. I'm saving them. My weeds are so strong, I'm saving the seeds to give to people who can't grow their own. Oh, said the landlord, Arabelle, what a mess, what a wonderful mess. My yard has roses and daisies and all sorts of things, but I don't think my little boy has ever seen a beetle or a snail in his life. Well, you're welcome to bring him to my garden, said Arabelle. Oh, thank you, said the landlord. And with that, he hurried off and soon came back with a little boy, younger than Arabelle and much neater and cleaner. Hello, said Arabelle, and she took him around her garden. She said, This is my beetle bush. Wow, said the little boy, looking at all the beetles. And these are my mole holes, she said. The little boy sat right down in the dirt and peered into the holes. Oh, boy, he said. And these are my snail trails, said Arabelle, pointing to the shiny trails along the ground. The little boy lay right down on the dirt and tried to look a snail in the eye. This is wonderful, he said. I'll even give you some of my weed seeds, said Arabelle. The little boy took a handkerchief out of his pocket, and Arabelle put some of her weed seeds in it, and they tied it shut. Oh, thank you, he said. Now, how do I get the snails and the beetles and the moles to grow? Oh, don't worry about them, he said. They'll just come, Arabelle said. Okay. And then he looked, and behind the weeds he said, Arabelle, what's that? Arabelle looked over, and the landlord walked back and pushed some leaves aside and said, Arabelle, you have a watermelon growing back here. I do, said Arabelle, and she hurried back to see it. She brushed the dirt off with a clean spot of her shirt and looked at it. Wow, she said, this is wonderful. How does it feel to not be a failure anymore? Said her father. I don't know, said Arabelle. I'm still getting used to it. She tucked the watermelon back and patted the leaves around it. And that night, before she went in, she said good night to the snails and the mole, and she patted her beetle bush. And then she went into her bedroom and took the sign off the door. Instead, she wrote a new poem that she put up on her door, and it said, "Snails and moles are gentle souls. Bugs and weeds have simple needs. And all unwanted things I know are grateful for a place to grow. And now that I am a success, I do not love them any less." By Arabelle Mott, ex-failure. The story of the beetle bush. I've also got a little bear on my story hat, and today he's going to remind me of the story of Beady Bear. Beady was a toy bear, a wind-up bear, who lived with a little boy named Thayer. A wind-up bear, he had a key, and you would stick the key in and turn and wind him up, and when he was all wound up, he would walk and go around, and he and Thayer would play and play. One of their favorite games was hide and seek. And when Beady was all wound up, he never wanted to stop to go to bed, but he knew that when Thayer went to bed, he was supposed to go to bed too. So, as it happened, one cold winter's day, Thayer had to go away for a little while, and Beady amused himself by looking at a book that Thayer had left open on the bedroom floor. It was an alphabet book, and as he turned the pages, he came to the letter B. B is for bear, an animal brave that lives in a cave. "In a cave?" said Beady. "Why didn't anybody tell me?" He gazed out the window of Thayer's room, and he could see a little hill in the distance. "I wonder if there's a cave in that hill." He got hold of Thayer's telescope, and he put it up, and he looked through it, and he scanned all over the side of the hill, and sure enough, "Oh, I think that's a cave," he said. "I better go see." And so he wrote a note. "I have gone to live where a bear is supposed to live. Beady," he signed it. And then he hurried off out of the house and up the hill till he came to the little cave, and it was just the right size. "Oh," he thought, "how perfect." He went into the cave and tried to settle himself down, but there were sharp, jagged rocks, and it was kind of uncomfortable, and it's a little bit dark and chilly in here too, he thought. I know what I need to make myself happy here. And he hurried back down the hill into the house and came trotting back up the hill, carrying his very own pillow and blanket from his bed. He settled down then. "Oh, this is much more comfortable," he thought. "But I still need something." And so he got up and he went back down the hill. And when he came back this time, of all things, he was carrying a flashlight, which he turned on in the cave, and then pulled the blanket up and settled down against his pillow again. "Oh, this is great," he thought. "But what good is the light without something to read?" So back down the hill he went again. And this time he came back carrying the evening paper, of all things. He made himself comfortable. He sat on his little pillow. He put his little blanket around him. He turned on his flashlight, and he read. And when he'd finished the newspaper, he decided it was time to go to sleep. But just then, he heard a noise outside the cave, and it was getting louder and louder. Oh dear, he thought, oh, I wonder if that's a bear. This is probably his cave. Beatty tried to be very, very quiet as he crept deeper into the cave, but suddenly he ran down and plop, he flopped over on his side and lay there. And then he heard a voice. Beatty, Beatty, are you in there? It's me, Thayer. Oh, thank goodness, thought Beatty, but now he was too embarrassed to answer. But Thayer crept into the cave and saw him. Beatty, you silly old bear, he said, you forgot your key. And he picked up Beatty and began winding him up. Oh, Beatty, he said, don't you know you need your key and me? Yes, said Beatty, but if I need you, what do you need? I need Beatty, said Thayer. And so, hand in paw and paw in hand, they went back down the hill into the house. And that night, when Beatty went to bed, he was truly the happiest bear alive. That's a story by Don Freeman. You're probably more familiar with his other famous bear, Corduroy. But years before Corduroy was there was Beatty Bear. I hope you've enjoyed these stories and come see us at the Milton Public Library. Use our dial-a-story or come to a story time. We'd love to see you there. Thanks for listening.